Hey, everybody. Welcome to the 99 Pages Book Club. This is Rajiv Srinivasan, your moderator, broadcasting live from South Lake Tahoe, California, the reading capital of the world. We're on a mission to make reading fun and achievable for all. Each week, we read no more than 99 pages of a book, and we'll live stream a discussion with awesome panelists and Q&A right here. Even if you can't squeeze in the reading, that's okay. You got 99 problems, reading ain't one. If you enjoy the conversation, please subscribe below. Every vote of support counts. Please also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn at 99 Pages Club. So today we begin our journey into CASTE by Isabel Wilkerson. We're covering parts 1 and 2 today. In this intro, Isabel Wilkerson introduces us to the structure of American society between caste, race, and class. She uses some vivid metaphors, for example, calling America's relationship with race and caste similar to an old house with structural problems that we've all inherited and must deal with. Wilkerson takes us on a journey to 2 other caste systems, India's and Nazi Germany, which we learned actually designed their laws after America's Jim Crow and segregation laws. Lastly, we read some harrowing stories of lynchings, which I think for many readers were quite upsetting. A couple admin notes before we get started. Next week, we're on Labor Day, so this panel is going to be off, but we are still going to be on. We're going to be airing a special discussion on the Indian caste system. We're going to take a deeper look at ourselves by looking at some of India's social hierarchy, and we'll be joined by some religious scholars, journalists, and business leaders from around the world. So we're very excited about that discussion. We'll be back here September 13th, 7:30 p.m. Eastern, 4:30 p.m. Pacific to get back to CASTE parts 3, 4, and 5. So before we get started here, I think we need to acknowledge some other context in our world right now. So about a week ago, a lot of us saw videos of Jacob Blake getting shot 7 times by Kenosha, Wisconsin police and subsequently handcuffed to a bed. We saw 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse fatally shoot 2 protesters with an AR-15. In San Antonio, U.S. Army Sergeant Darren Daniels was shot by San Antonio police after they were responding to a call to the Red Cross for a potential mental health suicide risk, and the Red Cross sent the sheriff's department. And also in San Antonio, we saw Matthias Ometu was forcibly arrested while jogging. He was determined to be the incorrect suspect, but was still detained and eventually released on bail, but we're not really clear what his charges were or what went down. So, of course, we also saw, over the past couple of weeks, the DNC and RNC conventions. This past weekend, we had the NAACP March on Washington. So it's been busy. So with that, what I would love to do is take us back to some questions, and I would love to just introduce our panel before we get started. So first and foremost, I want to introduce Bobby Merriweather, currently a cybersecurity consultant in the Bay Area. Just an amazing story from some rough parts of Philly to the Army, and just has incredible passion for these issues. I'm so lucky to call him my friend. Next, I want to bring in Stesha Doku. So Stesha is a Duke, Stanford, Harvard-trained anesthesiologist and a healthcare design expert currently in North Carolina, another very passionate voice on all these issues. And she and I have been friends for a long time. I'm just so blessed to be able to call her a close friend. I also want to make sure we call out Mrs. Jackie Bello. She's a former Baltimore public school teacher, Teach for America alum, now an ed tech innovator here in the Bay Area. And Jackie and I want to call out, we're actually working on a book club just for educators that hopefully we're going to be launching in the not too distant future. So we're very excited about that. And we know to all our educators out there, y'all are going through some tough times right now. And just know that we're thinking about you and we're with you in spirit. And then I got to say, we are particularly blessed and fortunate today to have Mr. Jonathon Monken. He is a former director of the Illinois State Police, as well as has a really long list of accomplishments and, quite frankly, just incredible service to our country. So, Jonathon, we're so grateful to have you on, and we're going to get to you in just a second. But first, what I want to do is actually bring in Stesha. So, Stesha, I think you are a wonderful person to kind of begin this conversation. This book talks a lot about a social barrier of caste that separates us predominantly on the basis of race, and that sort of keeps us in our places. But look on this call. We have 3 people of color all making decent money, having attended elite universities. You yourself are Harvard, Stanford, Duke. These are the benchmarks of any American, let alone white or black. So can you maybe help some folks in the audience who are new to this topic understand, how can there be such thing as caste when someone like you or Bobby can really achieve such crazy levels of success?
Sure. Well, I think that first, you have to sort of look at caste and think about how there are two different levels of things to discuss. On one hand, individuals can have success, and not everyone in an individual group or in a group is going to be the same, right? Not everyone's going to have the same experiences. And so a caste is a system. And so it may not apply necessarily to individuals, but it can apply to groups overall. So that's one distinction. But I think the other distinction is that if we focus only on the financial or academic piece, then we sort of miss out on the social and psychological piece that has, I think, a greater role when it comes to caste. And so this book is really interesting because it provides finally a framework for me to sort of discuss with people what privilege is like. And so the examples that I'll use, the first one being that in this book, Wilkerson describes this incident where she goes and is supposed to be, she is a New York Times reporter. She's supposed to be talking to someone or interviewing them. And the person shows up late. And when they get there, they assume that she cannot possibly be the person who's there to interview. And the assumption is based off of perhaps her sex, perhaps her race, but even given her credentials, she's asked for her credentials and she gives them. And this person does not acknowledge her as the role that she's in. And I think that when you think about people who have had success financially and education wise, that is a problem that we run up against, that even at the highest levels, we're sort of challenged whether or not we should be there. In my own personal life, I'm a physician. Day to day, I take care of patients. When I walk into a patient's room, they assume that I'm not the physician, right? Like I had one, when I was working in the hospital, one patient who assumed I was there to take his lunch order and immediately started asking me about, or telling me, yeah, I see the look on your face, Reggie, telling me what his lunch order was. And even when I told him, that I was his physician and introduced myself that way, he continued to not acknowledge me as a member of his team. Those sort of incidents make me very much feel like there's a caste system in place where even when I give my credentials like Wilkerson does, that I'm not acknowledged. I will go a step further to say that this framework sort of gives me a way to talk about white privilege in particular. And I think a lot of people sort of challenge the idea of white privilege. And a lot of the argument tends to be around, I can't possibly have benefited from white privilege because I grew up poor, or, they bring in sort of financials, or I didn't go to the best schools. And I think that when you say those things, you forget that not everyone has had those same opportunities. And many times it has been because of race. You don't have the opportunity to be able to rise up out of poverty. But also you forget that once you do sort of get up to the highest levels, whether it's in education, whether it's financially, that you don't get questioned if you're a white person, how you got there, how hard you worked, or whether or not you're deserving. And I think that for some of us who have had really great experiences, unfortunately, we still get challenged in that way. The very last example that I'll use, if you remember what things were like when Obama was a president, the policies he wanted to implement were often challenged. And a lot of people would say that he was being challenged because of his race. And you could say it could have just been politics. Maybe they weren't allowing him to wield the power that he was given because of politics. But on the other hand, when you look at something like the birther movement, where they basically said, look, this person is not American, or challenged him based off of his ethnicity. That shows that even if you elevate someone to the highest office in this country, where you do have financial and educational success, that people will still challenge whether or not you belong. So I think that it really is a different framework to look at it that goes beyond financial and success, but also talks about how groups are sort of marginalized even when they're able to get somewhere. But I mean, I'll throw it back to the panel. I don't know if you guys buy that a caste system exists or what your sort of interpretations were, but all those incidents I see very much as being part of caste.
Bobby, I'd love to turn it to you, man. I would love to hear if this is something that you can relate to as well.
Yeah, definitely. I cannot phrase it or package it any better than you, Stesha. So I really appreciate that. I will support her response in how this gave us like a great framework in which to understand like our personal perspectives and our personal experiences and how to make it make sense, because there are not a lot of people like us that look like us that rise to opportunities or get invited to opportunities like which we were afforded to. So I could say I do believe that there are systems in place that are of old, that a lot of people in this generation, whatever your background, whatever your color, whatever your religion or creed is, I think a lot of people in this generation are trying to make an adjustment to. But it takes a long time, you know what I mean? And I was just fortunate enough to be raised as a fighter, and no matter what challenges in front of me, I'm just going to keep pursuing through it. But I faced those things as well. You know, for instance, me in the Army, I was a company commander in charge of 200 infantry soldiers. I was one of the only uh, Black Airborne Ranger qualified infantry officers in that location, in that region of the states. So everybody kind of knew who I was. So there's a lot of scrutiny. And even though people knew who I was, I would go to some areas with my company and they would say, "Where's the commander?" And I would step forward and they were like, "Well, are you the, liaison for the commander?" I'm like, "No, I'm actually the commander." So, people would challenge you based off of their preconceived notions, whether it's subconscious or conscious, that they're not used to you being here, or somebody like you being here. But there are a lot of people in this generation, I want to reiterate, that are looking to make the change. They just don't know how. But I think we take it all the way back to the framework. That CASTE talked about, the CASTE book talked about CASTE as a system is like a house. And if you're an owner of a house, if there's a problem that is left unattended, it's going to fester and continue to get worse. You have to address that problem. I think a lot of people in this generation are trying to address that problem. They just don't know where. And this gave us a framework. So kudos to you, Stesha, for bringing that in.
Right on, right on. Jackie, look, the next question that comes to my mind, and I know to a lot of people who are still kind of not really understanding what's going on here, is like, at what age is this really manifesting itself? So you were a public school teacher in Baltimore. Like, did you see CASTE in action in the classroom? Like, how do things like body language, behaviors, how do they manifest themselves in CASTE in children of like young ages? And I guess did you have a sense of like how early these CASTE identities can be ingrained in young kids?
Yeah, well, first of all, there are many manifestations of caste in public schools. Based on your question, I'd say one immediate example is how I would see Black students discriminate against each other based on colorism. My students who were darker skinned, they internalized the message that they weren't as beautiful as lighter skinned classmates. They would get compliments like, "Oh, you're pretty for a dark skinned girl." Or I had male students that would say, "I only date light skinned girls," which is really sad and hard to hear, but also, the skin lightening and bleaching industry is like a multi-billion-dollar industry. So that's one thing that comes to mind. But other examples of caste in public schools are how segregated our schools are, how few Black teachers there are, how underfunded our predominantly Black and brown school districts are, and then, of course, what is actually taught in public schools. I mean, reading this book, Rajiv, was such an education for me. Like the race riots of 1863 mentioned in this book, the largest race riot in America, I'd never heard of or learned about.
Yeah, I think that it's almost like a different history that, both you and we grew up in Virginia, right? And I remember fourth grade, every Virginia elementary school student, we're learning about Virginian history. And, I love my hometown. I love Roanoke, and I love my teachers, and I love my school system. But yeah, there were a lot of details that were not really made, put in our textbooks. Let's just say that. Bobby, I want to come back to you, man, because one identity of yours that we haven't talked a lot about on this show is you're also a parent, and you're a parent of a Black beautiful child. And I'm just curious, man, like if I were in your shoes reading this book, and I'd be thinking like, am I noticing these behaviors in my own child? Like, do you have to think about raising your child in a way to mimic caste, either a higher caste, lower caste? Like, do you do you mimic them? Do you teach them to mimic them for like issues of success? And then I guess as a follow-up to that is like, do you remember adopting a caste identity when you were a kid? So, how do you view this as a parent when you look at your own child, and then you yourself and through your childhood?
That's a great question, Rajiv. Thankfully, my beautiful baby girl is only 4 years old. So she's just now coming of age where she's, getting her on her FaceTime and, getting her personality and stuff like that. But even in her youth, I could see her being such a strong, young, beautiful Black child that is going to grow to the same as an adult. One thing that I've learned growing up that, was instilled into me from my parents was to always be true to who you are and to treat people like you want to be treated, the golden rule. And it's interesting how, us as Americans, collectively are very individualistic, sometimes subconsciously as well. But we often forget the golden rule: just treat others like you want to be treated. So I'm going to train. That's my army coming out, but I'm going to teach my daughter to, just be true to herself, know who she is, and treat others as she want to be treated. Always give respect unless somebody shows that they're undeserving of your respect, and to be loyal to who you are and loyal to your cause. But make sure your cause is rooted in being true to who you are and giving back. Like those simple principles, I think if we just make it transparent and allow it to permeate throughout society, I think we'll be better collectively. I just find it very interesting. I'd probably save it for later on in the conversation, but just find it interesting that some people could be so strong in their prejudgment based off of, their perceived notions of, who's in front of them without really getting to know who that person is. And I'm fortunate that I had my military experience to where we're serving, life and death situations with people of all backgrounds. So that kind of diminishes that. So I think the more we collectively as a society go through things where we are relying upon each other, I think that will reinforce the teachings that I have for my daughter in-house.
Fantastic. I want to call out, we just had a great comment from Mr. Alan Chase. The book CASTE does a great job of putting the draft riots in NYC during the Civil War into the paradigm of caste. Recently arrived European immigrants resented being forced to fight on behalf of slaves. What an interesting point. Thank you for that, Alan. Stesha, I would love to give you a chance to comment on this. Like your childhood, like, did you feel caste like kind of getting ingrained to you in a young age?
Well, it's an interesting question because my parents are from Ghana. So I felt like we had more of an immigrant mentality in terms of how we sort of approach race relations than I felt like growing up that I was just primarily Black. And I think that overall, immigrants tend to try to have the favor of the dominant caste as sort of described in this book in terms of trying to be or excel in terms of education, living primarily, if not within sort of your own community, living in white communities. And so I very much felt like that was a bit of my childhood. I felt sort of like I was an in-between person where, a lot of my friends that I went to school with were white, and we lived in a white neighborhood. And so I didn't really have the sort of experience of having a lot of Black friends growing up as a kid. My identity wasn't really around being a Black person as much as it was being an immigrant standing out in this group or first generation American standing out in this group. But I also think that with the Black people that I would interact with, like I would be called an Oreo. They would say that I was white on the inside, Black on the outside. They did not see me as being sort of one of their own. So me and my sisters would always say that we sort of felt like we were this in between where we didn't really feel like we belonged. And then the funny thing is that my parents, on the other hand, were like, you guys are Americans. Like they're Africans, they are immigrants. So like to them, like when they would get mad at us, they'd be like, well, you guys are Americans, and show their differences in how we sort of responded or acted based off of that. So I think that throughout my childhood, the sort of different forms of identity just mattered to based off of who I was interacting with at the time. The one other thing that I'll add to Jackie and Bobby is that if you guys have not ever seen the doll test before, I recommend that you watch it. It is, don't do it now because we're on YouTube and you would have to go to YouTube to watch it, but it is and we don't want to lose you, but it is a psychological test from the 1940s. And it basically demonstrates how early kids can codify some of these ideas of caste. So watch it and just, see what you think. But some of it can be quite appalling to see how early kids sort of form their ideas of what a Black doll and what a white doll may mean.
Super interesting. That was the doll test. So if we go to YouTube, viewers can just check that out. That's good to know. I want to bring in Bobby and Jonathon for this question here because so we're going to talk next week about the comparisons to the Indian caste system and on that journey that Isabel Wilkerson took us. But I want to actually spend a moment on the sections on Germany and the Nazis actually using American laws to design their own caste system. And, so Bobby, let's start with you, man. Like you're also a combat veteran, proud soldier. How did it make you feel to know that the Nazis, the quintessential enemy in our American folklore, modeled their systems off of American segregation laws? Like, did that break any sense of pride in you? And so, because I know when a lot of Americans read that, we're going to feel like a lot of guilt and shame when we react to that chapter of the book. And, you know, this is new to a lot of people, right? So, you know, Bobby, I'd love to hear how you read that section of the book, how it affected you. And, you know, then I'd love to bring Jonathon in to ask the same question. But Bobby, let's start with you, man.
Yeah, that's a strong question. The best way I know to answer that is honestly just from the heart. So ultimately, when I've read that and I've learned about that, I've heard about it before, but the reason why it just kind of came back to mind this time was because I never really took that into my own personal practice and how I executed my leadership. So one thing I've always been taught, again, was to kind of take one of my phrases my mom actually says is take what you need and trash the rest. You know what I mean? So I take the structure that I needed to execute my job as an Army officer and as a soldier, both in garrison and in combat. But I apply it to my personal leadership traits. And one of my things was in combat, nothing else matters but executing the mission and supporting your family. And I treated all my soldiers like they were one of my family members because they were. And we have some pretty, you know, gruesome stories we could all talk about later on and stuff like that. But ultimately, I did not allow that to affect me presently. But at the same time, I'm not totally surprised because when I came back from our tours and we reintegrate back into society, it's just interesting. We go through times like these that are not new. And sometimes we're viewed by people that don't necessarily look like me and probably did not serve in combat situations. We're not viewed as American enough. And it's like, you know, it kind of catches you off guard. Like, I'm American enough to fight and lead soldiers into combat, but I'm not American enough to be not racially profiled, go down the street. So I always go back to my thing in the Army is, you know, when you're in the military, you deal with people of all backgrounds. And like, we just learn to just, you know, squash whatever preconceived notions of prejudices we have, because we're relying upon each other for life and death. And that's like as pure as you can get. So it made me feel, you know, a little down, but I know in my military experience, I did not execute in that manner. So, you know, just Charlie Mike, keep moving forward, you know?
Charlie Mike, indeed. I love it. Jonathon, I'd love to, you know, one of many accomplishments of yours is that you are also a, you know, a combat veteran. And actually, you know, I'd love to give you an opportunity to just sort of introduce yourself to the following, and then actually ask that. I'd love to hear your response to that question as well. By the way, this is kind of interesting to all our viewers out there. We have more live viewers today than we've had for any of our live streams, and yet the quietest chat. Like, I know this is tense, y'all. And I know that's why a lot of y'all are coming on to this live stream. These are tough subjects we're all grappling with. I would love your participation. Know that this is a safe space. Please engage. You know, we're here to answer and have this conversation as a community. So don't be shy. Jonathon, love to have you introduce yourself and respond in the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me to participate in this great dialogue. I mean, I think, like you said, these are tense subjects. These are not easy. So even people that are passionate about talking about these types of topics still struggle to get the right words out. And what I would encourage people to say is spend less time thinking about perfecting every little word and be more focused on making sure that in your own mind, you're communicating the feelings that are most important to get across in this type of conversation so that we can actually have an understanding. Because I feel like the varnish associated with perfect comments robs them of their gravity, right? It doesn't drive the point home of being able to say, and I have to say, just listening to everyone else responding to the initial questions. First off, my first read was I had way too easy of a life that did not require a lot of critical thought walking into this. And yet the experiences that I've had have provided way more context for this conversation than I ever thought any of them would as I was going through them. And so part of those experiences from the Army side, I'm in my 19th year in the Army. I'm in the reserves now. I've been in the reserves, I've been in the Army National Guard, and I've been on active duty and been in combat. And I think that in particular, when we talk about what it means to the military and what the fight against fascism meant to create a military identity of an all-volunteer force that's there defending the Constitution and the rights of all of the citizens of the country, and that is what is the call to defeat fascism, is absolutely devastating to really understand that it shows how much a caste system relies on structure. And there is no better way to create structure, for better or for worse, than to have those foundational laws. The crazy thing about it is it's what provides the top cover, to use another military term, for people who wish to enforce a caste system, to wish to formalize a caste system. And when you're talking about how we educate kids or how we teach kids, we're talking about this intersection point of following the rules, of doing what's right, of understanding what you're supposed to do in certain circumstances, and you would defer to what it says in black and white in the law as what right looks like. And under these circumstances, you can tell how confusing it can be for people to say, well, the law says that this is allowable, so why wouldn't it be the right thing? If it wasn't the right thing, it wouldn't be the law. And you can see the systematic way that the Nazis use this for goes back to Hitler's comment that the people will fall victim to a big lie more easily than they will to a small one. And when you create this, when you transcend legal authority to moral authority, that was the pivot. They realized that it's actually the subtlety, the relative subtlety of the Jim Crow laws that made it so effective for them. It was nowhere near overt enough for people to see it so clearly as to what it was intended to accomplish than the dehumanization of a specific class of people. And that is the evil power of what it's capable of doing when things are codified into law, that it transcends the moral argument that we're attempting to engage people in.
Well said, sir. If you guys don't mind, I'd love to just pull out and look at the live chat, because we've got some great questions coming in. Andrew Cunningham, one of my dear friends, also from Roanoke, Virginia, representing. He has actually brought up some really interesting questions regarding the nature of gender and caste. And Jackie, I know you pay attention to these live chats, so I don't have to regurgitate the whole question to you. But I want to make sure I give you a chance, because you can speak from that perspective. Like, do we also have this concept of gender caste in America as well? And I would love to hear your reaction to Andrew's question.
For sure. So I think the book, Isabel Wilkerson does a good job of differentiating racism and casteism. And she says caste is really more about power and about kind of subjugating other groups based on their perceived hierarchy, their status in the hierarchy. And gender is definitely, as well as sexual identity, as well as class, is definitely a part of caste. Stesha was talking about her experiences growing up as a Black woman in healthcare. Even as a white woman, I've met with CEOs who only make eye contact with the Black coworker at the male coworker at the table, and not me. And so gender is definitely a part. Like she talks about caste as like holding fixed roles in society. Men have tried to keep women at a fixed, subjugated place for hundreds of years. However, I think the most important argument Isabel Wilkerson makes is that Blacks have been at the bottom of the pyramid since before the founding of the country. So gender is definitely a part of the hierarchy, of the pyramid of hierarchy, but Blacks have been at the bottom for as long as it's been in place in this country.
I actually think Amitav Misra he chatted something out that I think is really interesting. It's like the 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote only applied to white women. And so it's kind of like when we celebrate this, very what we typically regard as a monumentous achievement is actually only like half the solution, because we still weren't given minority women the opportunity to vote. And so Jonathon, the question that's coming through my mind here, because I know we have a lot of white male viewers who, when people talking in terms of caste say, women, Black people, they've all been subjugated. They don't have power. All the white men have power. Like, there are a lot of white men out there who legitimately don't feel very powerful. And I know this is a little bit of a spontaneous question, but, I'd love to kind of just get your reaction to that. Like, for those who are white men who may be struggling because they don't really understand the power, like, is this real? Like, how do we talk about this?
Well, unfortunately, I think this is a feeling that has been stoked substantially in recent years where there's this perception. And I think Stesha said it best when we're talking about the concept of privilege. Well, I wasn't handed anything for free, or I struggled when I was young, or I was poor, or had challenges in front of me. Completely misses the point of what it means to be privileged in the first place. And I think from this powerless standpoint, it's the sense that they have to communicate power in a more explicit way because they feel that it's not being communicated implicitly. And the implicit communication is the fundamental nature of the caste, right? It's about small things. It's about everything from body language to what Jackie said about eye contact to how people stand, how people talk. And I think what you see now is you see this compelling need from white men who feel like someone is telling them that they have always had this source of power, and yet in certain circumstances they feel powerless. So they feel this need to try and communicate power more explicitly in a more literal sense. And that's where you run into circumstances where you see, when you look at homegrown violent extremism, when you look at white nationalism, that's the message that's resonating to recruit more people, is that we need to regain this power that has somehow been lost. And anything that really challenges that hierarchy, that their position in the caste, is something that just drives it further. And I think an interesting point that was raised earlier, take the Irish population on their arrival to the United States. In many instances, they were considered the lowest form of the white caste, right? During the Irish potato famine, they were coming in, they were not being treated well, they were being immediately handed a Union blue uniform and saying, you're now in the Union Army, and that's how you're going to earn your keep here in the United States. And what's interesting about it is one way they were able to really go into professions that allowed them to try and harness this sense of lost power was, one, to differentiate themselves from the lowest class, from the African American and Black community. The second thing was, if you think about the Irish traditions in public service entities like law enforcement and fire services, they went into these professions that demonstrated their worth, gave them literal power in these circumstances, and then allowed them to ingratiate themselves with the highest caste, of saying, we will enforce the laws that are passed. We will ensure that these laws stay. And it was their move to make sure that when they arrived, and the same thing was true of other European immigrants, and this was highlighted in the book very well when you talked about Polish immigrants and Eastern European immigrants that came to the United States and didn't have an awareness of how race and caste played off of one another, suddenly arrived in the United States and realized that what they had to do immediately was differentiate themselves from the lowest caste. Immediately. It was the first thing that they had to do. Distance themselves from the lowest caste as quickly as possible and find the most literal sense of being able to take that power.
Well said, sir. Thank you for that. Actually, Jonathon, I want to stay on you right now because I think, this was a very emotional week for me and for a lot of Americans, namely in the vein of the Jacob Blake video. And folks, if you haven't seen it and you are okay with some very upsetting images, it might be something to consider looking into. I'll generally summarize what we saw. Jacob Blake was called, the police were called responding to a domestic situation. Jacob Blake is seen just kind of interacting with these officers. He is seen walking around his vehicle, and then all of a sudden, without hearing what's going on or hearing the orders, but what we do see is the cop is following him with his pistol, and then grabs his shirt. And as he's in the car, he's shot 7 times. And that really horrified me, Jonathon. And, you led a very massive police department. You were knee deep in this bureaucracy. The National Geographic, when George Floyd was killed, actually called these as like modern day lynchings. And I know that's a really loaded, hard question to put on you, but I'm curious if, this idea of police brutality being classified against lynchings offends you, or whether you can sort of like empathize with those Americans who, see these atrocities and are like, actually, there's a lot of similarities here. So I'm just curious how you as a police department administrator react to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime that police use of force occurs within a department, it is a very charged issue immediately. So during my tenure with the Illinois State Police, anytime there was an officer-involved shooting, it didn't matter where it happened, when it happened, under what circumstances, I was immediately notified, just because the entire department needs to be made aware of an officer-involved shooting immediately. And that in and of itself should speak to the gravity of the circumstances in which lethal force is used by any officer. And I think the question that you're really getting at here, when we talk about the comparison to excessive force to lynching, is the concept of really vigilante justice versus justice that is part of a legal system. But I think what has to be taken into consideration here is that, the circumstances ultimately had a similar result, which is an excessive amount of force disproportionate to the circumstances in a way that I don't think anyone would immediately defend as typical of how law enforcement should be interacting in that circumstance. And I totally understand the perspective that being on the ground and being involved in the incident, as Bobby and I have in combat, is not a circumstance in which easy decisions are made. They're all difficult decisions. There are no easy decisions in that circumstance. But in this moment, lethal force is authorized when the officer feels that their life is in danger. Just like the rules of engagement in the military say that if your life is in imminent danger, you have authorization to take lethal action. And that is not how it played out in the video. And that's what makes it so painful to watch. That's why it makes it so difficult to understand what the circumstances would be that would lead an officer to feel that. And I think it's almost impossible to derive anything like that from the video, where you don't see a circumstance where the officer's life is in immediate danger. You can postulate, and believe me, I've heard so many different, well, maybe there was a weapon in the car and that's what he was going for. Maybe he was going to use the car itself as a weapon and he was going to try and drive over officers with it, or trying to reference someone's legal history or criminal history, which was not available to the officers at that moment anyway. So it has no bearing on, what they think or how they're going to act. All of those things are factors, but I think what people need to walk away with is that lethal force is something that is only a last resort, which is not necessarily what the law says right now. And we talk about this briefly about what federal law enforcement and whether or not lethal force is the act of last resort. And in this case, it's hard to see anything other than excessive force in a moment that almost took a man's life.
Yes, sir. Well said. And Jonathon, I just want to take a moment and acknowledge, like, it's very brave. A couple of weeks ago, we had another police officer, Mr. Brian Crossick, on the show. And now you're here as a former director of Illinois State Police. I think we all just are really grateful for the bravery it takes to come on here and ask these kind of very difficult pointed questions. So thank you for that. And I have more for you. I hope you don't mind. I think I wanted to bring you on, and talk about this because, like, when we watch the video of Jacob Blake before the 7 shots, like during the escalation, I don't know about you, but I could see several signs of CASTE at play, his posture, and multiple officers following him around with weapons drawn. And then simultaneously, we have this other 17-year-old white kid with an AR-15 walking around. Right. I believe his name was Kyle Rittenhouse. And it seems like he almost went by without consequence. And so my question is really, in your professional opinion, was there anything about Jacob Blake's posture in the video that, according to police doctrine and training, would have classified like suspicion, danger? Like, I'm really trying to give the benefit of the doubt when we can. So I would really appreciate you kind of enlightening us and see, like, maybe we can get in the heads of this officer.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges is that for law enforcement, right out of the playbook, there's 2 things that I want to highlight. One is that de-escalation should be the prerogative of the officer, meaning you should be thinking in that mindset, not how do I escalate this situation? It's how do I de-escalate this situation? And I think in these types of circumstances, what you saw, the posture did not reflect that, right? It was not an effort on the part of the officer to de-escalate the situation. The second thing is that posture in and of itself, this is an interesting thing for the Illinois State Police specifically, is that in many instances, troopers travel alone. They patrol by themselves. There are very few instances, unless it's a junior officer with a field training officer, when they have more than one trooper in the car. And something that's imbued in them from the very beginning at the academy is that your posture will indicate how ready you are for a dangerous situation. There's a reason why they take their uniforms very seriously and making sure that everything's perfect. There's a reason why they approach the vehicle in a very specific way, that if someone is thinking about escalating the situation on the other side, that their first impression is, I should not. If it looks like the officer's lackadaisical, not paying attention, disorganized, disheveled in any way, it suddenly opens this door that maybe escalation could be productive to getting me out of this circumstance. And so when you flip the script in this circumstance, there's this general sense about how I've read so many stories about how minorities have attempted to teach their kids, if you see law enforcement, the first thing you do is, right, hands up, I'm not going to move, no quick movements, nothing. It's an immediate subservient behavior in that circumstance. And I think it's easy to say and hard to do, especially depending on the circumstances you're in. And I think what we saw in this instance was it appeared that he was really walking away from the situation. I think Jacob Blake's sense was, I can't control this situation. If I stay, I risk escalating in a way that I don't want to, and I'm going to extricate myself from it entirely. And that doesn't communicate or translate well if it's just physical movements without verbal confirmation of what's happening. And it's unfortunately, it opened up an amount of interpretation that the officer clearly took in a different direction. And those are the circumstances that you're trying on both sides to avoid as much as possible. And I think that what we saw there was a failure to de-escalate and a failure to read body language in such a way that it indicated a reduction in the chance or possibility of violence. And instead it went the other direction.
So if we could take a step back then, Jonathan, because, you know, when with videos like this, we almost convolute the individual racism, individual cast, like as an isolated incident of a police officer just making bad choices. But are there, when you look at that video and like, what are the institutional policies and problems that are governing his behavior that you see as problematic? And I'm just curious, like when you see these videos, whether it's George Floyd, Philando Castile, et cetera, I know you're, you know, very, you know, up on these issues. Like, do you see institutionally racist policies which kind of create these problematic contexts? And what are some of those? How, as we as like voters, when we go talk to our elected officials, what can we be saying? Hey, I get it. Maybe this cop was an isolated bad apple, but here are some institutional problems that we have that kind of create the context for these bad issues to happen in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of this is understanding that the policies themselves and the behavior of officers individually, the alignment between those two things is extraordinarily difficult to achieve. And I can't tell you how many times as an administrator, not having been a cop on the street day to day, working these types of issues, there's always going to be the disconnect between what is being experienced by the officer that's engaged in that on a regular basis as compared to the administrator that's trying to find a way to systematically improve. And I think what you see is the institution of law enforcement has really moved in a direction in recent years when you look at the militarization of law enforcement, right? All of this excess military equipment over the last 15, 16 years, it's been transferred from the military directly to law enforcement and has really kind of taken a completely different tone in terms of how law enforcement officers view themselves in these circumstances, contributes to those types of senses around escalation and what the circumstances are. I also think that law enforcement, and I remember saying this because it's true, which is you're trying to make sure that the officers are protected, just like you're trying to make sure that your soldiers are protected. You're not going to put them in harm's way without purpose, for no particular cause. But what you're trying to do is figure out, what am I also doing to protect all individuals that are interacting with the police? What else am I doing to protect people that are having these types of interactions that require an unbelievable amount of discretion on the part of a single individual trying to understand and execute policy? And I think one of the biggest gaps that we see is there are tools for accountability. And, you know, so we can talk about body cams or dash cams and the types of things that are intended to bring about greater accountability so that officers know that You can't just completely operate independent of the chain of command and do whatever you want to do. But there are also these concepts around what the behavior of law enforcement looks like in terms of the type of training that we receive in the military. It's not like you graduate basic training and then they say, good news, you're never going to have to go through professional education again. It's the exact opposite, right? Your entire career, you are constantly, you're being exposed to more fundamentals and principles of leadership, more things that you need to understand about what it means to possess this level of lethality, this level of authority, and how you choose to interact. And I think the hardest question now is, I still remember feeling this in 2004 in Iraq, which is, and I think police feel this right now, which is they are being asked to do things that are not part of their profession, that they are not trained for, that they're not equipped for. And the same thing is true when you take a soldier and say, it's not a combat mission, it's a nation building mission. And the first thought for the 19-year-old soldier that hears that is, did I miss that part of basic training? Nation building, was that actually part of something I was supposed to be doing? And so I think what you have is in the community policing environment, officers are not equipped with the type of training and the supporting policy that helps them understand the circumstances that they're in so that they can execute in a proper manner. And so what you're left with is this broad swath of authority that's granted to an officer to exercise discretion in a variety of different circumstances, many of which are not part of any formal training that they've received. And what they defer to is either their instinctual response or some experience outside of professional education that has taught them this is how to behave in this circumstance. And that's not fair to the officer, and it's certainly not safe for the general public.
Well said. So, I mean, just a clear lack of like that continuing education. Yeah, wow, it's a great analogy. You know, I'd love to open it up to the rest of the panel. Stesha, Bobby, Jackie, would be interested to hear your takeaways from the book, applying it, you know, especially from these latter chapters on lynching that were quite upsetting, and seeing those parallels with the police brutality incidents we keep seeing. Like, any insights here? Would love your thoughts.
I just want to share for those of us who are with us when we were reading 5 Days last month, I was really struck by the anecdote right at the end of our first 99 pages, the end of part 2, where they talk about the lynching of Will Brown. And they said that the rioters, the white rioters of the dominant caste, cut the water hoses to keep the firefighters from putting out the blaze when they'd set a courthouse on fire that was trying to protect Will Brown. And that reminded me of what happened to the student Greg in a Black uprising in Baltimore after the murder of Freddie Gray, where he also cut the fire hose. So it just made me think, Jonathan, about vigilante justice versus hopefully creating a legal enforcement system that brings out real justice, and just the ills of violent protest and rioting in general. So that's just one reaction I wanted to share, and a tie between the books, and particularly as I think about what's been happening in Kenosha.
Good job bringing it full circle, Jackie.
I love it. Oh yeah. For those who are new, we read 5 Days last book last month. It was a really awesome experience and a great pilot. So we appreciate it. Jonathan, I actually thought that we were before we got on, we had this really interesting discussion. And I hope you don't mind if I kind of pick on some of those points that we were talking about real quick. So there's a bill right now in Congress called the George Floyd Police Reform Bill. It has passed the House. It's in the Senate right now. And it does something which I think is going to be, like, I think you believe also is going to be the most controversial thing, which is it lowers the standard of sort of immunity that a police officer has. So today, our understanding is that they're primarily charged only in criminal court, which requires beyond a reasonable doubt. And then the standard is willfulness in terms of breaking regulation. The bill actually takes away that immunity so that they, can be tried in civil court, where it just requires a preponderance of the evidence. And then it changes the word willfulness to recklessness. And so can you talk to us a little bit about what this means for the average police officer and why this is so important in this discussion on this bill?
Yeah, I mean, I think in large part, the reason why the laws were put in place and really started in 1974 in Maryland with the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, of recognizing the fact that if any police officer could have charges levied against them in civil court, the line would be endless, right? In every circumstance, that the perception is that it would never stop, and that law enforcement officers would not be able to take the necessary action that they need to if they could be held personally liable, financially liable for what unfolded in an engagement with the public. And so even under the criminal category that we have today, the expense that major metropolitan police departments and county sheriff's departments experience is really staggering. I mean, I think people would be stunned to realize how much money is expended, public funds are expended due to the settlements that stem from these types of charges being filed. It's substantial. And I think the aversion to be able to expanding or reducing, I should say, immunity that officers have access to is that no one would ever join the police department again, because they realize that in the mindset of an officer, execution of standard duties would inevitably result in civil charges that are financially unsustainable for the institution itself and for the officer individually. But I think what it intends to bring about is accountability, of just saying that if you give this broad-based immunity to officers, that what the sense is that there's almost nothing that they can be punished for. And I think the challenge there is understanding how we bring accountability to the system in a way that's compatible with how units of government fund and field police departments and the laws that they enforce. And it has to be considered. It absolutely just has to be considered, because you have to have accountability to the degree that the public understands that their safety, their protection is of primary concern to the law enforcement officer. And until that's accomplished, I think you're going to continue to see the type of tensions that we have today with law enforcement and especially minority populations, until the sense of that accountability is in place.
So, Jonathon, how do you react to the counter argument that many folks would say is like, look, we have a country of one of the most armed countries in the world. Like, everybody and their brother, it almost is like you get issued a weapon, on your 16th birthday, your sweet 16. Like, there's like 350 million weapons out there in the United States. So with such a heavily armed civilian population, like, I mean, why are we spending so much time talking about taking power away from police when, like, how can we expect them to confidently police a civilian population that is just, riddled with weapons? Like, isn't this unfair to police officers? Like, I'm curious to your reaction.
Well, without a doubt, the lethality of the profession has increased over time. There's just no question about it. Now, certainly that's a byproduct of the fact that we're not one of the most armed countries in the world. We're right. It's not even close. And I think in that circumstance, what you have is because of that, you get into this. It's actually an institutional example of escalation versus de-escalation. And I think what you have is, when you see that militarization of the police that's occurred in the last 15 years, that is a very overt escalation of the availability and access to increasing levels of lethality on part of law enforcement. And what that's done is also brought it up significantly on the side of the general population as well. I mean, make no mistake, officers are at risk all the time. But the answer to that question is not saying, great, if they bring it, if they bring a knife, you bring a gun. If they bring a gun, you bring a tank. Like, that's not the fundamentals of de-escalation. And I think the circumstance now is that what people are realizing is that there is imminent danger on both sides of this coin, for law enforcement and the general public, and that's completely unacceptable. And it's disproportionate, drastically disproportionate to the African American population, which is just completely unacceptable. And I think that's where reconciliation needs to happen, of understanding that escalation in this sense is not the solution.
I think that's just, I think for a lot of folks, that's a very healing thing to hear from a police administrator, sir. So thank you for that. Jackie, I saw a question come in from Amber Mace that I really wanted to direct to you. She asked, and I think this is so sweet and genuine of her. She's like, I'd love advice about when we say something that causes offense, besides apologizing and taking responsibility for our misstep, do you have any recommendations on how to repair that relationship? And, obviously, Bobby and Stesha, we need to absolutely hear your thoughts on this too. What have people said or done that have made you kind of fix that gap? So Jackie?
Yeah. I mean, one, as a white woman, I need to own my own work. Like, I don't want to only just lean on my Black friends to help educate me. And so if I do make a mistake, I think ownership is important, as well as saying, like, this is what I'm going to do. But really, I think admitting openly the times where I might have acted in a racist or casteist way is super important. I started a nonprofit in Baltimore that served predominantly Black students. What are ways that I could have made more space for Black leaders, Black board members, how to amplify Black voice in my own organization, including, giving myself maybe less of a seat at the table? How do you make room for more? So that's one thing I think about, is how do we kind of own our own work, and also then be not just an advocate but an ally, and help educate. How can I help educate other white people just to have these hard conversations? Like Jonathon said, we sometimes overthink and we're afraid of saying the wrong thing. It's still way more important to jump in and engage than to stay silent.
Absolutely. Stesha?
I fully agree.
Yeah.
Sorry, Rajiv. I think you were on mute. I stepped on you.
Oh, you're good, man. Stesha, Bobby, go ahead. Please continue.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you, Jackie. I think, it all comes down to, what Jonathon was talking about, that personal accountability on both sides. And I think, when we talk about both sides, we're talking about the law enforcement and civilian population that there's charged to serve and protect. I think the more we come to a place where each side is trying to understand what is most important for the other side, I think we could have more of an understanding where we could take personal accountability and say, okay, where have I overstepped my boundaries, and how could I prohibit it from going again? Like, we talked about the military having prescribed professional development training that you have to go through, and it's inculcated in your brain. So sometimes it just becomes like a habit of action in terms of how you approach situations. So I think that could be one approach. But I think at the very bare minimum of everything is, finding out what's most important to you. I talk to officers, what's most important to you, officer? And sometimes officers ask us the same thing. So I think the more we get down to understanding each other, the better we can take personal accountability to have effective change on the outcome.
Fantastic. Stesha?
Sure. I mean, great answers from everybody. The only thing that I would probably add is that, intentionality is important. And I think that we're all sort of used to sort of running on automation, and everything that's happened in the last couple of weeks and the last couple of years has really made people take a step back and think a lot more and be a little bit more meditative, I think, about what our actions do and what our thoughts do. And I think that has been one of the biggest changes that I've seen, that people are willing to have these conversations because they're actually analyzing and not just going through their day to day. So I sort of encourage people to keep doing that, because I think that, like this book says, if we don't even try to take stock of what's happening in our lives or try to even see what's underneath, it makes it so much more difficult for us to correct action in the first place. And so by doing that, we can do the things that Bobby and Jackie and Jonathon suggest, which is to, at the end of the day, be accountable for ourselves. But we can't do that if we don't know what we're doing to actually impact other people.
Well said, Stesha. Folks, we are at time. And I know I just want to first off say thank you to everyone on the live stream. Thank you to our panel. This is a first round of CASTE. This is going to be an emotional ride, and I'm really excited to continue on. I know I'm going to grow, and I hope we all grow, right? Like, we have Americans in this country in pain, and I don't care whether you're progressive, conservative, black, white, whatever your situation is, when a fellow countryman's in pain, we got to listen for that. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to get out of this book. Folks, we're going to have Jonathon. I'm going to give you the last word as our guest, but I'm just going to close this out by saying thank you all. Please consider subscribing to our channel if you enjoyed the discussion today. We're going to be back on September 13th discussing parts 3, 4, and 5 of CASTE. But next week, it's not going to be live. It's going to be premiered. Don't worry about what the difference is, but we're going to basically have a discussion with some folks around the globe. It's just crazy time zone, so we couldn't really get it straight live, but it's going to be a pre-recorded discussion on the Indian caste system. I'm really excited to kind of, like I said, take a deeper look at ourselves by looking at another country's implementation of caste. So again, thank you very much for your time. And Jonathon, just your final parting words, your advice for our followership as we continue in on this book. Would love to have you send us off.
Absolutely. So I can't thank you enough for the opportunity to speak. I'm so thankful to have the whole group here that I had an opportunity to speak with too. And the input and insight of everybody has just been phenomenal. What I wanted to offer up is, so I'm a father of 3. I have a 7, 8, and 9-year-old sons. And I think something to recognize here is, I love the question that you asked, Bobby, because it is so on target for why this is an important discussion, which is, no one is hard-coded with these beliefs, right? This is not actually like just in your DNA, and then you wake up and decide without you're making the proactive decision to believe in something or make a decision about something. And that means that it's up to us to actually interact with our children, talk to them about these issues, give them the opportunity to understand what the circumstances are. And if we can't see the structural problems that are in place, we are absolutely not going to be able to solve them, and neither will the next generation that has the opportunity to step in and do it if they are not aware of it. And so every opportunity that people have, the conversation is going to be different at every age level and every cognitive level for kids. But amazingly enough, it starts even earlier than any of us care to admit, because it's so challenging. And 9 times out of 10, what you've got is nonverbal cues, or what kids are reading. How you interact with other people, not necessarily directly with them, is what they see. And that's why I think this conversation is just so important, because it starts small and it needs to be something that we're always aware of. So I just really appreciate the conversation, and I hope everybody takes the conversation offline inside their own houses when it's done.
Indeed. Well said. Well, thank you again, Jonathon, for joining our family here.